Lymphocytes, whenever they are present, they indicate either a tubercular etiology or a viral etiology. I told you for tubercular etiology, history should be long. So what is left is viral etiology. Hey guys, welcome back. The topic that we're going to study today is medicine recall questions of the recently conducted FMG exam in December 2021. Well, all I can say is desire is something that always fuels your passion. Desire is something that always makes you excel. So keep the focus on and we get started with the very first question. This talked about a 70-year-old man. He was having chest pain and then he showed a ECG in which various subtypes of MI were given and one option was of pericarditis. Every time you get a ECG based question, what you're supposed to do is look for evidence of any myocardial infarction per se, because anyway, I mean, that's one of the common scenarios that is asked, and you always look for evidence of ST elevation. Lots of guys, when they looked at this ECG, they were mainly focusing on the chest leads per se, because they were looking for the commonest type of MI, anterior wall MI, which shows ECG findings in V1 to V4. The point is, what you can see here is definitely T waves, which are slightly, I would say, bigger than normal, and therefore they would tell you that there is evidence of ischemia. Now listen to my words very carefully. Whenever the T wave amplitude is increased in myocardial infarction, initially you always have evidence of ischemia, but after ischemia you have infarction and then you have cell death. But when you use the word infarction per se, you need to find evidence of ST elevation. So I'll just zoom it in. Lead 1 per se is not showing any evidence of ST elevation. I will also use this opportunity to calculate the heart rate of this patient. You can very well see something like about 4 to 4.5 large squares. So the heart rate of this patient is relatively, I would say, on the lower side of normal. And then I can notice a very characteristic ST elevation. Just highlight this before you in lead number 2. I could also pick up a ST elevation in lead number 3 and also in lead number AVF. You very well know that lead number 2, 3 AVF study the right side of the heart, and right side of the heart, actually the right ventricle is not on the right, it is inferiorly located. It forms the base of the heart, it is touching your diaphragm. So the findings are suggestive of inferior wall MI. To be doubly sure of my diagnosis, what I'm also going to do is look at lead number AVL, which is going to be having a evidence of ST depression, and I'm going to call it reciprocal changes. I repeat the fact once again, before you are commenting on the diagnosis, you must always look at reciprocal changes also that would be present in lead number AVL. Now please remember that the findings of ST elevation indicate infarction. First you have ischemia, then you have infarction. So the T waves which were present in the actual exam, which were looking relatively bigger, were evidence of ischemia, but he asked you to pick up infarction per se. So this is not an anterior wall MI. I agree that the commonest type of MI is anterior wall MI. But this particular chap is suffering from inferior wall myocardial infarction, and just 1 week before the actual exam, I conduct sessions on YouTube also. I think you would have anyway subscribed to the channel, but the point is, it was just by chance. Believe me, you know, I had discussed almost a similar looking ECG, which was showing this very characteristic ST elevation in lead number 2, 3 and AVF per se, and was showing reciprocal changes of ST depression, as I mentioned before you, in lead number AVL. Even in the ECG that I showed, the T waves were relatively, I would say, relatively bigger. So it was just accidentally that I can say that this ECG was discussed. And even in the snapshots, I have always emphasized on this fact that you must have the capability to differentiate an anterior wall from an inferior wall MI. In anterior wall MI, you get a very classical ST elevation, but the findings would be found in lead number V1 to V4, whereas in this particular question, you can see the findings are mainly present in 2-3 AVF, which helps in confirming the diagnosis. Why it is not pericarditis? Let's look at it. Pericarditis is going to be having a ST elevation, but it is not going to be convex upwards, it's rather gonna be concave upwards. So I'm just gonna sketch it before you. I mean, instead of having a convexity, which I drew before you, it would be having a concavity. Another finding for pericarditis would be that the findings will be seen in almost all the leads, because pericarditis is all around the heart, no? So almost all the leads will be showing a ST elevation, in contrast to MI, where only few specific leads will be showing a finding. When it comes to posterior wall MI, you would be having ST depression in V1 to V4. Yes, guys, you'll be having ST depression in V1 to V4. So you're gonna ask your technician to put in the special leads. That is gonna be V7, V8, V9. That it will be showing a ST elevation. So the message here is that for posterior wall MI, anyway, it's the posterior descending artery and even the left circumflex that can be involved. But you must be having both of these present in the question, and there was no mention of any V7, V8, V9 in the question. So by exclusion, the answer for this question will work out to option number beta. And most guys were, having a dilemma to answer as A versus B, because the traditional impression is that anterior wall MI is more common. Yes, left anterior descending artery is one of the commonest arteries that is involved in myocardial infarction. But always look at the heart rate also. Because lots of guys said, sir, because I was confused, how did I resolve it? I resolved it by looking at the RR interval. You can see that the RR interval in this patient was having a heart rate on the lower side of normal. In anterior wall MI, there is always a sympathomimetic stimulation. That sympathomimetic stimulation will result in tachycardia. But in inferior wall MI, it is the vagus nerve that is involved. Vagus nerve involvement causes a heart rate to go on the lower side. So here you can see, because the heart rate is on the lower side. So that would again be a supplemental, I would say, information that could be provided to you in the exam, and you must pay attention to the heart rate. Moving to the second question, the question said this is a young patient who's presented with sudden onset fever and agitated behavior for 2 days. Now, every time you are having a CNS based question with fever, altered sensorium, altered mentation, and a short history, you must think in terms of a viral etiology or a bacterial etiology, but not tubercular etiology, because in tubercular meningitis, you would always be having a history that would be spanning, I would say, weeks. So tuberculosis is unlikely, but still let's read the question further. There were no meningeal signs, but EEG shows periodic focal temporal lobe spikes. Now, whether you have picked up this EEG finding or ever you have read this EEG finding in your life, that really does not matter. What really matters is that temporal lobe involvement is what the examiner is trying to tell you here with a short history and the CSF of these patients. You very well know the fact that normally in the CSF there would be approximately 0 to 4 lymphocytes. Here they were approximately 40 in double digits, and majority, there were total of 40 cells, out of which 90%, that is 36, were basically lymphocytes only. So lymphocytes, whenever they are present, they indicate either a tubercular etiology or a viral etiology. I told you for tubercular etiology, history should be long. So what is left is viral etiology. And before we mark the answer, I'm just going to show you a snapshot from the app as well. I have highlighted that the number one cause of encephalitis in India is Japanese bee encephalitis, but the overall global cause for why encephalitis could be developing in a patient is herpes simplex, and the I would say herpes simplex has a predilection. I'm just zooming it in for your convenience. It has a predilection to involve the temporal lobe of the brain, and the clinical diagnosis on the basis of the history that is given with temporal lobe predilection would be viral encephalitis, that is herpes simplex encephalitis, and therefore I will be giving acyclovir for management of these patients. Every time they give you a clinical STEM question, your first job would be to draw in a diagnosis. And once you have confirmed the diagnosis, in this case, you would be giving acyclovir. How did I rule out tubercular? Because I told you in tubercular, the history would be relatively longer. The number of cells will also be more, and proteins are grossly elevated. He will not say elevated protein. He will use words like cobweb coagulum. I request you to go through the questions of the previous years, prior to these papers also, where tubercular meningitis has always also been asked. Why answer is not ceftriaxone? Because ceftriaxone is useful for acute bacterial meningitis. So anyway, he should be giving you meningeal signs. And suppose the patient was very irritable, you could not elicit meningeal signs, that is okay. But in bacterial meningitis, you will always be having at least more than 1000 neutrophils present per cubic millimeter. Here there were total cells only 40 present, right? And amphotericin B is anyway useful in cryptococcal meningitis. So if the question was talking about a AIDS positive truck driver who's having cryptococcal meningitis, then you definitely would be thinking in terms of answer as amphotericin B. So it's always a good idea to look at the other options in the MCQs also, though this was fairly a straightforward case of a viral encephalitis. Remember, herpes simplex 1 has a predilection for the temporal lobe. That was the key word in this relatively a long stem question. Moving to the next one. Here, a MBBS student was asked to diagrammatically make a axis deviation of a patient. Every time I have, in the entire app, in snapshots, you will notice every time there is a ECG, I will draw a axis. All you need to remember is that for a normal individual, the normal axis of the heart will be something in the range of about -30 to +110. Though I mean in some books it may be written as -30 to +90 also. Some slight variation can be present, but every time you draw x and a y axis, on x would be lead number 1, on y axis would be lead number AVF, and this particular quadrant that I have mentioned here before you is normal axis. However, suppose in the exam, now I'll give the answer to this question also, but suppose in the exam next time he gives you a vector. This is the vector that he actually gave. Suppose this vector was in this particular quadrant, then your answer will always be given as extreme axis deviation, that would be EAD. On the other hand, suppose he gives you the vector in this particular area, I mean the upper left quadrant I would say, then this would be representative of left axis deviation. So I'll just put in the data here so that you can remember it. But in the exam what he drew was, he drew a vector, and the vector was present in this area, that is right axis primarily. So this would be right axis deviation, and right axis deviation is seen when right side of the heart will become bigger. Left axis deviation is seen when the left side of the heart will become bigger. I mean in earlier times we did not have echocardiography. So by axis we used to check out which side of the heart is relatively bigger. The correct answer for this particular image would be RAD, that is right axis deviation is suggestive of right ventricular hypertrophy. He also mentioned a very dicey option like normal axis in obese individual. So one thing is very clear, this is not normal, and I just want to tell you that in obese people, I'll put it like this, that the weight of an individual is also inversely related to the axis of the ECG. So in I would say very fat people, right, what happens is that the axis instead of normal tends to become left, and in thin people it tends to become right. I repeat the fact once again, weight is inversely related to axis. By axis I mean as compared to normal, you just need to remember that in obese individual most of the time you would be having a left axis deviation. That's mainly because you see ECG is a vectorial analysis. So if there's a lot of fat in the chest, it will affect the vector. So mathematically, that is what we find, that in fat people, it's usually a left axis deviation. But the vector that was given was very peculiar. I mean, something in the range of about 130, 140, 150 degrees, no? I mean, this is going to be 90, no? This is going to be 90. So this was pretty, I would say about 30 to 40 degrees on the right. And I made my students hand draw it. Everybody drew almost the same diagram. Right axis deviation suggestive of right ventricular hypertrophy. The next question was widely debated. I think if you have given the paper, even you would agree to this fact that the question's history was very non-specific. 18-year-old female with recurrent infections of the respiratory tract, and the ECG was given. Every time they give you the ECG, first step what you should do is you should always calculate the heart rate of a person. So that's what we are gonna do. And majority of chaps, they said, sir, there was approximately about 4 large squares. I mean, you can very well see I can count a little more than 4. But if you will move a little laterally in the ECG, you will notice that the number of these squares will change. I'll just jot them down before you. You can see that the number of the squares is changing. As a result of it, I can see that this is going to be a variable RR interval. Whenever you have a variable RR interval, you always will be thinking in terms of atrial fibrillation. The first differential diagnosis for variable RR interval is always atrial fibrillation, and the highlight of atrial fibrillation is that the P wave in the ECG should be absent. I spoke to a large number of students. Was the P wave present? Everybody said yes, boss, the P wave was very much present. So the answer to this question definitely cannot be atrial fibrillation. I'm ruling out option number C, though this was my first thought process. When it comes to atrial flutter will anyway be ruled out because it will be having that classical sawtooth waves. Now I'll be showing the ECG of atrial flutter to you again also on the subsequent slide, but the point is at the moment that classical sawtooth is not present. So I'm ruling that out. I'm left with Wolff-Parkinson and sinus arrhythmia. A lot of guys casually answered this as Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. First, I want to tell you guys, Wolff-Parkinson is a very rare diagnosis. I mean, even an experienced cardiologist with maybe 10 years of practice, he will not be comfortable telling a patient by looking at ECG, oh, you have Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. So why, if what I'm saying is, if an experienced cardiologist is going to be having doubts, why would an examiner ask a 22, 23-year-old fresh MBBS guy who has just completed his MBBS that is it Wolff-Parkinson-White? So first, don't go for rare diagnosis in the exam, which people tend to have a habit, or very rare thing is asked. So point number 1 is mine is that rare things should be answered relatively later. That's one. Second, Wolff-Parkinson-White should also always be having a broad QRS complex. Definition of broad QRS complex would be more than 0.12 second, because every time there is going to be a presence of a WPW, there's going to be delta wave coming up that I have hand drawn before you multiple times. But when I had a chat with majority of my students, I think even from this ECG, I think this was almost the exact replication of what came. And you are able to see that the QRS complex is going to be pretty normal, about 2 small squares or 0.08 seconds. So there are two reasons why am I ruling out Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. One, it's always a rare condition. Second, it should be having a presence of a broad RS complex, whereas in the actual exam it was a normal QRS complex. So the answer is by exclusion, sinus arrhythmia. And what is sinus arrhythmia? Then guys, this sinus arrhythmia is a physiological phenomenon, that is there is variation of the heart rate of yours and mine with inspiration and expiration. As I have explained in the app, as I've explained in routine videos even on YouTube, that our blood pressure fluctuates with respiration. Our JVP fluctuates with respiration. I repeat the fact once again. Just like our JVP varies with respiration, our blood pressure varies with respiration. Our blood pressure becomes lesser on inspiration, tends to become normal on expiration. Similarly, because BP is fluctuating, heart rate will, because both are interlinked, no? So blood pressure fluctuates with respiration, even heart rate fluctuates with respiration. This is a physiological finding that I wanted to remember. Sinus arrhythmia. The answer to this question would be option number D. So let's look at a couple of these ECGs here. In fact, if I just zoom it in the very first one, you will notice that I have tried to show a variable RR interval. If you compare the number of the squares between the R and the R, there's a gross variation, and I cannot pick up any P wave present here. There is some semblance. I'll just draw this before you. There's some semblance of a T wave coming, but then there is no P wave present here. So the first ECG that I have currently shown before you is suggestive of atrial fibrillation, which is always going to be having a variable RR. But whenever you're going to be having this classical sawtooth pattern before every QRS complex, this is the QRS complex, then there's a subsequent T coming up and a sawtooth wave pattern, this would definitely be a atrial flutter. And they have been discussed in the relevant sections in the app. I definitely would like you to go through the ECG component. And then guys, this is what I was saying. The characteristic delta may not be present, but you would still be able to appreciate very classical broad QRS complex. You can see here the moment the P is finishing, there's gonna be presence of a delta wave slight deviation, and then subsequently there would be a broad QRS complex. So WPW is mainly asked in the exam in the previous years. In fact, WPW is a hot favorite of the examiner from MCA perspective, I will say, and they usually love to ask about the drugs which are used. Like one of the important drugs that has been asked for WPW in emergency scenario is procainamide. And they've also said that what will you give to prevent the fast conduction that is occurring in the bundle of Kent of these patients. So for the fast conduction, what I can be using in these patients is definitely flecainide. So from the drug perspective, it is fine. From theory perspective, it is fine. But even an experienced cardiologist will send the patient to electrophysiology lab before he comments on the diagnosis per se. So I would say that don't go for rare diagnosis. Coming to the next one, the question says, what is the best treatment for an unconscious middle-aged patient who's in an ambulance? And you can very well see that this person is having ventricular fibrillation. There's a twitching in the ECG. There's no PQRS T waves present. And because of the fact that there's a twitching of the heart, the patient will become pulseless and the BP of the patient will crash. So if this is happening before you, you obviously need to start CPR in the patient. So I'm going to look for CPR option here, and along with that, obviously I need to go for defibrillation. I agree that in Indian ambulances, defibrillator may not be available. So you would not have much scope here and the person will die by the time he reaches the hospital. But assuming that you are having all the facilities, you can definitely defibrillate. So starting CPR and defibrillation is the best step. Option number A, anyway, you will take the patient to ICU, but that's not going to save his life at the moment. Carotid sinus massage is what is given for paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, and in PSVT you will always be having a narrow QRS complex tachycardia. In fact, the ECG of PSVT is again something that has been discussed in the routine section of the app. So I would like you to just go through the ECG and the arrhythmias component. I've discussed it multiple times, even in the snapshots. So I think you will be much more comfortable. I mean, PSVT is one ECG that guys are able to pick up. So he asked ventricular fibrillation, and observation is too benign, I would say, an aspect. I mean, for you as a clinician, you need to act. I mean, your job is action, right? Your job is not observership. So answer to this question would be option number B. And I have discussed ventricular fibrillation multiple times. I've also highlighted that the DC shock which is given here is non-synchronized DC shock. In all tachyarrhythmias, we always give synchronized DC shock, but two arrhythmias where you always go in for non-synchronized DC shock is one gonna be pulseless VT. It's written as small pVT. Pulseless VT and ventricular fibrillation are scenarios where non-synchronized DC shock is given to the patient. The subsequent question talked about a patient of sarcoidosis. They love to ask about sarcoidosis, presenting with nausea, vomiting, and elevated calcium. You are anyway aware of the fact that there are non-caseating granulomas which are present in sarcoidosis, and these granulomas are responsible for the synthesis of vitamin D3, which is responsible for hypercalcemia in these patients. I'll just write NC here, which means non-caseating, because caseating is anyway what you encounter in tuberculosis. Now he says which of the following is least useful for the management of this patient. So every time you are gonna be having hypercalcemia, what you can do in the patient is first give normal saline to the patient with diuretics. The combination of this can also be written as forced diuresis. I want to highlight the fact that this was one of the options that a lot of guys marked as the answer, whereas he was not asking you what is going to be done. He was asking you which of the following is going to be least useful for the medical management of the patient. So initially you can give normal saline for hydration, load him with furosemide. By loading, I don't mean give bolus furosemide. It is always furosemide added to the bottle of IV fluid, and this would cause loss of calcium because furosemide causes calcium loss in the urine. You can be using bisphosphonates, that is the ibandronate, give calcitonin nasal spray. Calcitonin kya karta hai? Calcitonin will send calcium into the bone. If calcium will go in the bone, the calcium values will stabilize, and every time you are having hypercalcemia due to sarcoidosis, you can also give steroids, because I can use the word steroid responsive hypercalcemia. Sarcoidosis is an example of steroid responsive hypercalcemia. Coming back to the options of this question, he said which of the following is least useful. So I'm definitely going to use normal saline, I'm going to use steroids, I'm going to use bisphosphonates, but there is no role of mineralocorticoids anyway. I mean, mineralocorticoids means like fludrocortisone. So we do not use fludrocortisone. Fludrocortisone is what we use in Addison disease, where there is a mineralocorticoid deficiency. And I asked students also, was it mineralocorticoid or mineralocorticoid antagonist? Though it will not change the answer. I mean, mineralocorticoid antagonist is spironolactone. But everybody said, sir, it was not mineralocorticoid antagonist like spironolactone. I mean, even if it was mineralocorticoid antagonist, answer would have been still the same, option number A. Why I was asking was because the remaining three options were drugs basically. So I expected that option A should also be a drug, no, because mineralocorticoid per se is a very non-specific term. So I mean, when we interact, we obviously have a two-way communication. So obviously lots of data gets exchanged. And believe me, I had to go through about 5,000 messages. Believe me guys, 5,000 messages to come to this PPT to be made before you. The next question talks about this CLD patient who's presented to the OPD with fever. So every time you have chronic liver disease, there will definitely be cirrhosis, and cirrhosis will contribute to ascites, because he's himself saying no, he's having fever with gross abdominal distension. So considering the fact that there is a gross abdominal distension in this person, first thing that I'm very clear is that CLD patient is presented to me with ascites. On abdominal examination, there was some tenderness that was elicited in this chap, and along with this, maybe a paracentesis was done by the physician which showed presence of 500 cells. So first of all, we need to understand what is going on. In a chap with ascites, there is tenderness, there is presence of fever. Let's look at the cues here. The cues are fever. The cues are a tenderness in this patient and increased amount of cells. You see, every time a patient with massive ascites will come to your hospital, you should be doing paracentesis as early as possible, because if you don't, then the bacteria in the intestine can migrate, the bacteria in the intestine can migrate into this area and can cause development of infection, and the complication that would be developing in the patient would be called as spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. I'll just mention the data here, guys. The clinical diagnosis of this case, because he's having ascites, plus he's having fever, plus he's having tenderness, and the cells are increased. And cell count how much? I mean, obviously I would have loved if they mentioned neutrophils here. But I spoke to a lot of students. They said, sir, neutrophils were not in the option, only total count was given. I'll just zoom in into the discussion once again. I mean, in the app I've explained, every time you do a paracentesis in a person who's having cirrhosis for massive ascites, if we find more than 250 cells, that's neutrophils per cubic millimeter, you have to think in terms of infection, that is spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. But still, I'll just write down the diagnosis once again. I mean, you have to pick up cues in the question, guys. Every time they give you a clinical STEM question, you have to pick this up, and it's very simple, because in ascites only one thing can happen. No, either it will cause worsening, there will be tense ascites, there will be respiratory distress in the person. Why? Because if you have a gross ascites, it will limit the movement of the diaphragm, or there can be infection developing in it. And for any person having a spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, what are you going to do? Because there is infection present, you first have to clear the infection. No? So you cannot answer large volume paracentesis in this question. Large volume paracentesis is given in patients who are having presence of refractory ascites. By refractory, I mean that you are giving diuretics to this patient. Diuretics would be like spironolactone has been given, furosemide have been given. Both drugs, spironolactone 400 milligram, furosemide 160 milligram. I've given the maximum dosage possible of the drugs, and still the ascites is persisting. I'm going to call it refractory, and for refractory I'm going to do a large volume paracentesis. But this chap is having SBP. Albumin plus midodrine is used for management of a complication which is again discussed in the app. It's called as hepatorenal syndrome, that when the cirrhosis patient is going to come to you, the complaint is going to be oliguria. So next year in the exam 2022-23, if they ask you that a cirrhosis patient has come and he's having oliguria, anuria, renal shutdown, puffiness of the face, that is when answer B will be given. Octreotide is given whenever a person of cirrhosis is having bleeding varices. You very well know that the drug of choice for management of octreotide would be IV. Octreotide is the preferred drug for management of varices. So the correct answer for this question is anyway by exclusion also IV ceftriaxone, because we need to handle the infection component. You can solve the question both ways, either by exclusion like I'm doing at the moment, or it can be a stat answer also. But you need to practice questions on a daily basis, guys. I mean, I would suggest you to use the custom module and regularly do questions. And one video which is always a must would be electrolytes and ECG findings. I mean, I have not seen in previous 5 years any MCA exam or foreign medical graduate exam where they've not asked about ECG findings of hypo or hyperkalemia. It's always asked without a fault. Hypo and hypernatremia, hypokalemia and hyperkalemia are invariably asked. So please listen to it from the discussion that I have made. I mean, I know that, you know, in other subjects also they'll tell you some bits about electrolytes, but ultimately it will always be a physician who can tell you the best job. So here the question said tall T waves, wide QRS and prolonged PR interval. See, the bottom line is he's trying to tell you that the heart is becoming slow, because whenever you see prolonged PR interval, it's always going to be slowness of the heart. And which electrolyte causes the slowness of the heart? It is always excess of potassium. Whenever there is a rise of potassium in the body, it causes first a development of tall tented T waves. The QRS complex of the patient will become broad. You can see the superior, I have drawn two ECGs, this is normal and this inferior one, the QRS complex is broader. And the vertical height of the P wave, will gradually begin to reduce, the P wave will actually disappear. So the findings of hyperkalemia are anyway discussed. The answer to this question will be option number B. And for hypokalemia, I can say it will be ulta, it will be opposite. I mean, in hypokalemia, the ECG finding that you get will be that the T wave will become smaller and then will become negative. So you will call it T wave inversion. Hypo and hypernatremia do not produce any ECG findings. So anyway, you can rule them out. Hypo and hypernatremia cause CNS manifestations. If sodium is going to be less than 125, if potassium is going to be, I mean, the point that I'm trying to say is that sodium changes in extreme, sodium less than 125, more than 160, sodium fluctuations always are going to contribute to cerebral edema, it's going to contribute to seizures, but potassium fluctuations are going to affect the ECG of the patient. The answer to this question would be hyperkalemia. The next question says a 8-month-old child with diarrhea was given potassium correction. You anyway know, I mean, a diarrhea patient will always be having muscle floppiness, there would be weakness present in the body. So the doctor added potassium chloride to the IV fluid bottle, but potassium is not improving. The floppiness in the child is worsening. Now he says, which of the following electrolyte imbalance is responsible for it? I want to tell you guys that potassium and magnesium can coexist. Though I would rate this as relatively a difficult question, if you go through the electrolyte discussion in the PGME section, there I made it more exhaustive. Even in the FMG part, you will come across some of the aspects which I've described, but I just want to tell you at this particular moment to crack this question that hypokalemia and hypomagnesemia can coexist. Now, because hypokalemia and hypomagnesemia can coexist, therefore, if by giving potassium correction there is no improvement, you have to give magnesium to the patient. The answer to this question would be option number A. I mean, there's no great fact for this question. It's just a standard theory fact that most of the time in children who are malnourished, who are having diarrhea on long-term basis, magnesium deficiency can be present. So once you correct the magnesium deficiency, potassium values will also come back to normal. The answer today, you have learned that potassium and magnesium deficiency can coexist in a patient. So I hope that point, that should be added to your notes in fact. The subsequent question talked about a patient who's presented with features of cardiac tamponade, and he says which of the following is a true finding. Option A says pulsus paradoxus is always present. Every time we read cardiac tamponade, we always read about pulsus paradoxus. Now listen to the diagram here carefully. Pulsus paradoxus is definitely a feature of cardiac tamponade, but cardiac tamponade takes some time to develop. Initially, you can be having what is called as low pressure cardiac tamponade. In low pressure cardiac tamponade, the pressure will be only on the atria. Atria contribute only 30% of the filling of the ventricles, so the pulse will become weak but will not disappear. Pulsus paradoxus means pulse should disappear. So in cardiac tamponade, initially when the patient comes to you, because the pressure is compressing only the atria, so the fall of blood pressure may not actually happen, because of which I would say the pulse of the patient will not disappear. Pulsus paradoxus, yes, is a feature but may not always be seen. Why? Because cardiac tamponade will evolve over time. No, it's a low pressure cardiac tamponade and a unofficially high pressure cardiac tamponade. High pressure word is never used. We use low pressure cardiac tamponade and cardiac tamponade. The point is, when it is low pressure cardiac tamponade, you don't have a pulsus paradoxus. Pulsus paradoxus occurs with cardiac tamponade, which will take some time, because then it will crush the atria also, it will crush the ventricles also. If the whole of the heart is crushed, pulse will disappear. So option number A is not a correct statement. Pulsus paradoxus is a feature that is okay, but always present? No, that is not correct. Why? Because pulsus paradoxus is not found in low pressure cardiac tamponade. B says Kussmaul sign is always present. For Kussmaul sign, I have mentioned a mnemonic. The mnemonic for that is CRR, constrictive pericarditis, restrictive cardiomyopathy, and right-sided heart failure are features where you get Kussmaul sign. Kussmaul sign is always going to be a rise of the JVP. In you and me, JVP will fall, no? On inspiration, it will always rise. So Kussmaul sign is not seen in cardiac tamponade. In fact, when you go through the main section in the app, I've explained CRR is the mnemonic, and I've told there are 3 conditions where you get Kussmaul sign: constrictive pericarditis, calcification, restrictive cardiomyopathy, fibrosis, right-sided heart failure, but you do not get it in cardiac tamponade. So B is wrong. C says tall A waves. Now, I have never described tall A waves to you. I have described large A waves. I have described Cannon A waves, giant A waves, but this technical statement is wrong. But let's look at option number delta here. Jugular vein column is distended without pulsations. The point is, guys, I have highlighted, and I'll just write it down here before you. The most important diagnostic feature of cardiac tamponade is not muffled heart sounds. It's not Beck-Stride. It's not pulsus paradoxus. The most important diagnostic feature of cardiac tamponade will be that patient will be having a non-pulsatile elevated JVP. And if you have listened to me in the topic of cardiac tamponade, I have told you that in all conditions of cardiology, you always have an elevated JVP, and that is pulsatile elevated JVP. The only scenario where you get a presence of a non-pulsatile elevated JVP is gonna be cardiac tamponade. I repeat my statement again. In all conditions in cardiology, you are always gonna have a presence of a pulsatile elevated JVP, right? Pulsations will be seen. But in cardiac tamponade, pressure is so high, so grossly increased, that the pulsations tend to disappear. It's a non-pulsatile elevated JVP. The correct answer for this question would be option number delta. Slightly a tricky one with the words per se. I mean, as I've highlighted in all my sessions, I mean, words matter a lot. Coming to the subsequent question, he described a 65-year-old man who's having cold intolerance, hypertension and slow ankle jerk. So you anyway know that you are dealing with a case who's suffering from hypothyroidism. The TSH of the patient is elevated. Normal values were also given. So don't try to cram TSH values, T3, T4 values. It was simply the fact that normal values were given and the patient's values were given. And students told me, sir, TSH was elevated and T3, T4 was relatively lesser. So the clinical diagnosis of this chap is primary hypothyroidism. I mean, the gland is not producing T3, T4. So by feedback mechanism, TSH is elevated. Normal TSH values go up to 5.5. Here it is 16, that is 3x of normal. So that's by feedback mechanism. Now we have to start levothyroxine in this guy. Should I start at low dose? Should I start at high dose? The point is, first, the age of this patient is 65 years and he is also hypertensive. In old age, anyway, angina could be present, heart disease could be present. You see, starting levothyroxine is not a joke because levothyroxine increases oxygen consumption of the heart. If you start with levothyroxine high dose, it will increase the oxygen consumption of the heart to such a level it can trigger angina. Already the age is more, already is a hypertensive patient. In old age person with hypertension, if I trigger angina, I am causing harm to the patient. The basic essence of medical science is first do no any harm to the patient. So I will not like to start with a high dosage. Rather, I'll start from 25, gradually increase to 50. I mean, after 4 to 6 weeks, I'll get a thyroid function test and again, I can then increase to 50. And most patients between 50 to 75 will stabilize. Even in the routine section in the app, I've highlighted that there are various tablets available. The total dose to be given is 1.6 microgram per kg, but you start with 25, upgrade in this particular fashion. And I've always said never give 100 or more than 100 directly because it can trigger angina. Because thyroid hormones per se, they can increase the oxygen consumption of the heart to the level that triggering of angina can be occurring. So we are never supposed to rush into the treatment. Anyway, I mean, it's a chronic illness, so you can treat it gradually. The correct answer for this question would be option number A. Start levothyroxine at a dose of 25 mics and increase dose gradually. In this question, I've deliberately kept 5 options because when I was discussing with my students who cleared the exam with very good marks, some of them were adamant about the fact that, sir, one option was start T3 and T4 together. No, we don't do that. No, we start with levothyroxine only. I mean, T3 means liothyronine. Liothyronine, when is it given? We give it in an endocrine emergency with hypothyroidism, that is called as myxedema coma, and the details of this are present in the main section of the app. I mean, myxedema coma is characterized by hypothermia. That is where we give liothyronine to the patient, that is T3 derivative. Otherwise, it is simple T4 levothyroxine supplementation, which is always started. We can start from 25 mic tablet, go up to the tablet. I mean, you can increase the strength of the tablet, and the medicine has to be taken daily for whole life of these patients. The next question was on pheochromocytoma, very standard presentation, palpitations, episodic hypertension and diaphoresis. So he was satisfying that mnemonic for, PhD, palpitations, hypertension, headaches and diaphoresis. And he says what test is to be done for any patient with pheochromocytoma. Catecholamines and veneal mandelic acid levels can be done. Now catecholamine was obviously not in the option, but a derivative of catecholamine was given. That's going to be metanephrine. The answer to this question would be option number A. Option number B, I can rule out because HIAA is going to be encountered in carcinoid tumor / syndrome. HVA is a derivative of dopamine and we don't actually do HVA levels. And then chromogranin A is again related to pheochromocytoma, but it is not a diagnostic test. I mean, chromogranin A is what you read from histopathology perspective. Synaptophysin, chromogranin A, they are more of, I would say, immunochemistry component with respect to pheochromocytoma. For diagnostic purposes, I always need to rely on catecholamines or a derivative of catecholamine, that is metanephrine, which makes the answer to this question as option number A. The subsequent question was regarding a smoker, and he was describing a progressive deterioration of this patient to the level that he's having gangrene. So the moment you read a smoker, you are anyway thinking in terms of peripheral arterial disease. You definitely can see evidence of gangrene in the tip of the finger of these patients. Though traditionally it's going to be present in the toes, but even upper limbs can be involved. So that gives the answer as option number B, Burgers. Why it is not Raynaud's phenomenon? Because in Raynaud's phenomenon, there is a color change. on cold exposure, like this lady in a cold 4 degrees Celsius Delhi morning, she was cleaning her car. Maybe there was fogging on the windshield of the car, so she used cold water, and when she was cleaning the windshield of her car, the fingertips will change color. The fingertip will be having this discoloration, that is white, blue and red. So they have asked about this color change also. And anyway, Raynaud's phenomenon is more common in women per se, and here he described a smoker with the development of gangrene. You can see that this part is definitely requiring an amputation. Fournier's gangrene is ruled out because this will be involvement of the scrotal skin and is caused by anaerobes. And what is Einham? That Einham is given in Balian love in blacks, and this would be characterized by auto amputation. I mean, this old person, black, maybe a Negro basically, and African descent, and he was a auto amputation. The thumb simply fell off. That's called as Einham. And I mean, this is a very peculiar presentation given in Balian love. That's auto amputation in Negroes or blacks. The subsequent question talked about a child with recurrent episodes of blinking fast. He's doing like this, blinking, and then he's staring continuously, and this is occurring periodically for duration about 20 to 30 seconds. So I would like you to, just on YouTube, search the word epilepsy PrEP ladder, and you will come across a video by me where I have described how the seizures would be presenting. In fact, in the very first 30 seconds, you will notice a child who's having repeated blinking episodes, and then he's staring continuously. So this is a very characteristic feature of absence seizures, and for management of absence seizures, we can be using either ethosuximide or we can be using sodium valproate. Midazolam and diazepam, they both are useful for controlling a convulsion. I mean, we can use midazolam in the form of a drip, or we can give it even in the form of nasal spray, or we have rectal diazepam also. So you can give IV diazepam also, but the point is they are useful for controlling a convulsion. And phenytoin is anyway useful for management of, let me say, GTCS, but not in absence seizure, where the classical presentation would be present. I mean, always they used to ask in absence seizure vacant staring spells. But this time, instead of talking about vacant staring spells, they also describe what happens before the vacant staring spell, that the child will have repeated blinking of his eyes and then will be staring continuously at your face. And you're wondering what happened. I mean, this child was talking to you normally. It's not that he will become unconscious after the episode. After the episode, once the blinking will stop and the staring will stop, he'll start talking to you as if nothing has happened, and he will have amnesia. He's gonna forget what happened in the previous 30 seconds. But this is gonna happen again and again and again. So I would say from a teacher's perspective or a non-medical's perspective, I mean, it will be pretty distressing for a teacher to see that the child is having this kind of a behavior. So she told the parents, and then the parents brought the child over to your clinic. You did a EEG that will show that classical 3 per second spike and slow wave pattern. And again, the aspects are discussed in the CNS component in the app. The answer to the drug of choice for absence seizure is sodium valproate. Otherwise, we can use ethosuximide also. The subsequent question is based on ABG, and I can say like this, that almost every year one question on ABG is, I mean, every session of the exam, ABG question is always present. So he described a patient having breathlessness, dyspnea, and can't talk, and then ABG values are given. Even before I read the ABG values, I am thinking this looks like a respiratory problem because he's talking about breathlessness. On auscultation, prolonged expiration is noted, so I'm thinking maybe an asthmatic or COPD patient. The pH is less and PCO2 of the patient is elevated. So pH is less and PCO2 is elevated. If both arrows are going in opposite direction, it's a respiratory problem. And because the pH of the patient is lesser, I'm going to call it respiratory acidosis. And along with this, you can notice bicarbonate in this patient is also elevated. That is for the compensatory mechanism. No? So I can say that this person is suffering from a partially compensated. Why I'm not saying fully compensated? Because pH is not normal, pH is relatively lesser. So this is a partially compensated respiratory acidosis. Any chap with respiratory acidosis, you need to put him on a ventilator. Option number A, soda bicarbonate, is ruled out. Why? Because soda bicarbonate is useful for correction of metabolic acidosis. In metabolic acidosis, all the three arrows will go in downward direction. pH will also be less, PCO2 will be less, and bicarbonate will also be less. Ammonium chloride is useful for management of patients of metabolic alkalosis. In metabolic alkalosis, all the three things will increase. pH will be more than 7.45, bicarbonate will be more than normal value 26, and at the same time even CO2 values would be elevated. So A and B can be easily ruled out, because in metabolic problem pH, PCO2, bicarbonate, they either all three will decrease or all three will rise. But in this question you can see it was opposite. pH was less and CO2 was elevated, so it's a respiratory problem. For respiratory acidosis, we always go in for a non-invasive positive airway pressure, that's non-invasive ventilation will be used. And fluid resuscitation is a very non-specific thing. No, fluid resuscitation is what you do for patients of shock of the hypovolemic variety. So had he described a question where there was let me say gunshot injury, whether there was bleeding esophageal varices, ruptured peptic ulcer disease, which caused either a perforation peritonitis or there was an arterial bleed present, so I could have gone for fluid resuscitation. But it's a pure respiratory case with buildup of carbon dioxide. So if carbon dioxide increases in the body, it is going to cause asterixis, it's going to cause carbon dioxide narcosis. The person will be as if he is drunk. So you need to kick out this carbon dioxide by going in for non-invasive ventilation for these patients, which makes option number C as the right option. The next question talked about this young female. She was having weakness during blinking of the eyes, double vision, and also having dysphagia. The symptoms are increased at the end of the day. So every time you are having a neurology question and you're also having a diurnal variation of the symptoms, guys, the point is, if you're having one, females anyway have autoimmune conditions, that's okay. But if you have a neurological condition and there is a diurnal variation, like in neurology, symptoms, if they are present, they persist like that for months and years altogether. No, here she's saying, sir, in morning I'm okay, but by the end of the day my symptoms are worsening, my double vision is worsening. The when she's trying to drink water, or she's trying to talk continuously, or when she's trying to eat food, she says towards the end of my meal I feel as if I'm choking on the meal. So this is a very classical presentation that you always see with myasthenia gravis. Now why answer is not Patterson-Kelly syndrome? Because Patterson-Kelly will be having only presence of dysphagia, and along with this obviously iron deficiency, anemia, chylionicea should be given, but there should be no mention of any I would say eye manifestation, especially with respect to ptosis or let me say diplopia. So because eye manifestations are not present in Patterson-Kelly, it is ruled out. Thyroid disease, then he should write about either heat intolerance, he should write about cold intolerance, not given, so ruled out. Scleroderma again can present with dysphagia, but along with dysphagia, other features which are present are like Raynaud's phenomenon, or these patients can develop pulmonary artery hypertension, because you see in scleroderma there is fibrosis in all organs in the body. So dysphagia definitely occurs, but then you don't read about ocular manifestations. The key of this question would be ocular manifestations. I've always highlighted this statement. Every time you read a question of a female with ocular manifestations, you first always have to think in terms of myasthenia gravis, because no other neurology question will begin by describing a young female having ptosis on watching a cricket match, or let me say watching a movie on Netflix. Here she says, sir, I watch a movie, I start getting double vision and I start having drooping of eyelids, and I close my eyes, I give rest to my eyes, then symptoms disappear. And if I'm fiddling with my smartphone, suppose I'm just checking out my social media feed, so due to the bright light, because every time you focus on a cell phone your eye muscles are used, so in this lady, every time eye muscles are gonna be used, there's gonna be development of ocular symptoms, which is very classical for the diagnosis as myasthenia gravis. The answer to this question would be option number C. The next question talks about a barium swallow, and a very characteristic image was given. You can very well pick up the corkscrew appearance present here. The diagnosis of this patient would be given as diffuse esophageal spasm, because in achalasia cardia is always going to describe you a mega esophagus, and then there's going to be a abrupt tapering present. This is casually called as bird beak, but then bird beak is not recommended. It's rather a uniform narrowing. But if it's going to be a filling defect, then I am going to be thinking in terms of cancer of the esophagus. And if it's going to be a stricture, then stricture maybe will cause narrowing one, or maybe it can cause narrowing twice, but it's not going to be having a typical appearance like the one that I've shown to you at this particular point of time, which is very classical for diffuse esophageal spasm / nutcracker esophagus. The subsequent question said choose the correct position of the sites of auscultation. So all I want to say is that I can put up a mnemonic here for it, that is all physicians take money. We doctors are always taught to do social service, but considering the thankless society, I think it's always a good idea to charge a fees for your job. So it's the words APTM that I want you to remember. Aortic valve of ours. Aortic valve of ours is definitely on the left hand side, but the auscultation of the aortic valve is done on the right side on the second intercostal space parasternal line. I mean, if I just draw, this is manubrium sterni here. This is going to be the sternum of the patient. This is Xiphi sternum. So on the second intercostal space parasternally, this is where you keep your stethoscope to hear for the murmur of aortic stenosis. Similarly, if you want to check out the murmur of pulmonic stenosis, like the mnemonic for pulmonic stenosis I've told you is PAS, pulmonic and aortic stenosis result in systolic murmurs. So area number B is for primarily pulmonic stenosis. Now we are coming down to the left lower sternal border. This is the tricuspid area. So if you want to hear, the murmur of tricuspid stenosis, tricuspid regurgitation, then this is the site per se. And then we have area number D present, which is mitral area. This is where you can auscultate the murmur of mitral stenosis, mitral regurgitation primarily. The sites would be like this: second intercostal space for both the aortic and the pulmonic area. Tricuspid area, this would be written as LLSB, that is left lower sternal border, something around the fourth intercostal space. Mitral area is gonna be the fifth intercostal space, about 2 centimeter medial to the visible from the 4 options here. Just zooming it in for your convenience. A is gonna be aortic area, B is gonna be pulmonic, C is gonna be tricuspid, and then is the mitral area. So the correct answer will work out to be out of the permutation combinations given here as option number Bombay. The next question began by describing a patient who's having the worst headache of his life. Every time you read this question, worst headache of life, you anyway know the diagnosis of the patient is subarachnoid hemorrhage. And if I zoom it in, you definitely will know some whiteness in this area. This whiteness has been documented at the Sylvian fissure. In fact, I'll just jot it down here also. You see, whenever I talk about Sylvian fissure will separate the parietal from the temporal lobe. I'll just zoom it in for your convenience. You can notice the whiteness present here. This whiteness is the bleed present. So this is MCA territory anyway. So there is a branch of middle cerebral artery which has been hampered here, which is contributing to the manifestation. So I think a relative easy pickup here. A and B can anyway be ruled out because meningitis encephalitis would be having characteristic features with respect to, like, encephalitis would be having altered sensorium. Meningitis will be having nuchal rigidity. So that's anyway not given. Subdural hemorrhage, again, there should be some history with respect to person falling in the bathroom. Most of the time subdural hemorrhage would be like accidental slipping. Diabetic person fell in the bathroom, slammed his against the wall or against a tap or any metallic object, then it is subdural hemorrhage most of the time. So because of bleeding in the Sylvian fissure, worst headache of my life, those are the key words. In fact, whenever I've described subarachnoid hemorrhage, I've always highlighted on this fact, worst headache of my life, if ever written, it's always gonna be SAH. And blood nuchal rigidity can be present in subarachnoid hemorrhage also. The question said patient has a road traffic accident, his GCS is 9/15, there's no external bleeding, but when IV fluids were given, the BP is still low. Whenever you read this statement that you are giving IV fluids to a person who's having bleeding but the BP is still low, it's not even coming up to 80/60, not even coming to 90/60, it means that there must be some large compartment internal bleeding. When I say the word, in fact, I'll just jot it down also. I mean, the clinical interpretation of mine here is that there is some area where there's a substantial amount of bleed present. There is a large compartment internal bleed occurring in this patient, which is something like a tap. You see, you have put 2 wide bore cannulas in the patient. You are rushing in IV fluid, so you expected at least some blood pressure to be recordable, but in spite of your fluid resuscitation, the BP is unrecordable. Splenic rupture, if it has occurred, I said it's literally like turning on a tap. You are giving fluids on one side, it is leaking from the other side. Similarly, retroperitoneal hematoma. Retroperitoneal space is a substantial amount of space where blood can accumulate. Similarly, when it comes to hemothorax, the same point is there, that there would be blood, I mean maybe 1 liter of blood accumulating in the chest cavity of this patient, so the BP will crash. But if you look at option A, subdural hematoma, one I can say subdural space will be a limited space. I mean, after all, how much blood can accumulate here? Maybe 30 ml, 40 ml, 50 ml, max you can say 100 ml. So 100 ml blood loss, which is very, I'm really exaggerating it a lot, but even if that occurs, it's not gonna cause an unrecordable BP in the patient. And second, in CNS, you guys have always read about what is called as Cushing reflex. In Cushing reflex, there are two findings present. One will be bradycardia and second would be an increase of blood pressure. So when it comes to option number A, there are two reasons why I am marking option number A as the answer to this question. One, subdural hematoma will be relatively a small compartment bleeding. In fact, the bleeding will stop on its own due to tamponade effect because it's a limited area. Once the bleed will fill up that area due to pressure, due to tamponade, the bleed will stop by itself. And second, Cushing reflex will also come into picture, causing an increase of blood pressure of the patient. Whereas the question here is stating which of the following is the least likely presentation of an unrecordable BP in spite of fluid resuscitation. Option number B, C, D are large compartment internal bleeding. So how much you or whatever amount you give, I said it's little like turning on the tap in the body. On one side you're giving fluid, on the other side it is leaking. So the BP, I mean B, C and D are gonna satisfy the situation given in the question, but option number A is least likely or unlikely, primarily because of a small compartment bleed and the other allied aspects that I've explained to you. The answer to this question is option number A. Then this question described a 60-year-old man with complaints of early satiety, pallor, chronic abdominal pain for 6 months. So because of anemia component, I'm thinking it could be iron deficiency anemia or it could be hematological malignancy. Bone marrow biopsy was done and it is showing band in neutrophils. Band in neutrophils means immature neutrophils with basophil count of 4%. You see, basophil is one of the scantiest blood, I would say blood cells per se. And here we are having a basophil count which is relatively on the slightly on the higher side, with myelocytes, metamyelocytes and mature blasts given. Percentages were given, but the highlight of this MCQ is what they always teach you in pathology: shift to left. Whenever you read the word shift to left, it means that immature cell lines are present in large amounts. You see, what happens in a malignancy by the name of chronic myeloid leukemia is that there is gonna be a, I would say, proliferation of all the premature cells. You see, normally what happens in acute myeloid leukemia or acute lymphoblastic leukemia is maturational arrest. So only one cell will multiply again and again and again. But in CML, all the precursor cells like myelocytes, metamyelocytes, all of them are gonna start proliferating. So the moment I read about this question, which is having basophil count increased, a chronic history present, and simultaneously presence of shift to left, I'm thinking in terms of chronic myeloid leukemia, which means that Philadelphia chromosome will come into the picture, and the answer to this question would be option number B. Option number A, anyway, you know 814 is related to Burkitt's lymphoma. In fact, option number A as well as C as well as D all are related to Burkitt's lymphoma. For presentation of Burkitt's lymphoma, there will always be a child, Afro-Asian descent and a jaw swelling present, and most probably, and in most of the cases, he will also mention that the lymph node biopsy of this child was showing a starry sky appearance. So by exclusion also, this question can be worked out. Otherwise, the most important word in this particular question would be the term shift to left. The subsequent question talked about growth hormone levels being high but IGF levels are low. So basically it is talking about a receptor defect, because see, ultimately we are talking about a somatomedin. Somatomedin is the mediator which will be then responsible for growth. It is lesser, but the hormone levels are high. It means receptors are not working. So the language of this question is basically pointing towards Laron syndrome, which is also discussed in pediatrics. It's a defect of the receptor of the growth hormone, and therefore the answer to this question will work out as option number A. If you look at B, growth hormone level deficiency. So anyway, I mean, when I say high levels of GH, option number B can be ruled out. If you say GHRH, that is growth hormone releasing hormone deficiency, then again growth hormone levels will be lesser. So my point is that option number B and C can anyway be ruled out because growth hormone levels will be lesser. When it comes to GHRH receptor defect and then option number A, growth hormone receptor defect, we always should think in terms of common things, and Laron syndrome is what you read in the textbooks also. So the traditional topic will be the answer to this question. Laron syndrome is growth hormone receptor insensitivity. The next question talks about ABO and RH incompatibility leading to erythroblastosis fetalis. More of, I would say, pathology / medicine. This is an example of type 2 hypersensitivity reaction, and the cells are gonna be destroyed. There would be cytotoxicity that would be coming into the picture. The answer to this question would be option number A. The subsequent question was showing a very classical cannonball METs present in bilateral lung fields. And well, one of the important reason for cannonball METs, the moment I look at this image, I'm thinking in terms of this could be renal cell cancer. In OBGY, they obviously teach you about choriocarcinoma, and even breast cancer can contribute to this kind of a manifestation on a chest X-ray. Tuberculosis, anyway out, it will cause a cavity formation. Metastasis to the lung looks like an okay answer. Interstitial lung disease will always be having some reticular opacities. It will be having pulmonary fibrosis. So I'm ruling out option number C here. And fungal pneumonia, most of the time it's going to be aspergillosis, will again contribute to central bronchiectasis in majority of cases like in ABPA. So as such, when I look at these big round defects present, they look like, some holes punched into the lung because of the meds which are coming from a distant side. The correct answer to this question is Bombay. And anyway, I mean, these important causes you should be familiar with. Choriocarcinoma is what everybody knows, but even RCC and breast cancer aspect should not be neglected. The subsequent question is overlap of pathology and medicine. A stonemason from Kota, Rajasthan, who works in a stone breaking industry, has developed pulmonary TB. The moment you read about stone breaking industry, stonemason, you are thinking in terms of silicosis, because you very well know the fact that silicosis patients have development of silicotuberculosis. I mean, their lungs are already damaged by the occupational lung disease, plus they tend to develop tuberculosis as well. So the two keywords, I mean, stonemason and then tuberculosis will come to rescue. And the answer to this question would be option number A. For anthracosis, obviously he should be working in there should be coal exposure per se. For asbestosis, he should be working in a shipyard or maybe exposure to cement plant or working in construction business. And for berylliosis, he should be working in, let me say, rocket industry or aerospace industry. Most of the time, if a scientist is working in, let me say, ISRO, in that unit where I would say the rocket is being manufactured, that's where beryllium exposure can occur. So, occupational lung diseases are very well discussed in pathology also. So, I think this was relatively an easier one. In fact, there were two questions, but they had different approaches. Here he mentioned about a 45-year-old person who's having a 20-year-old history of working in a factory and is now having symptoms of chest tightness. So in all occupational lung diseases, we anyway read about chest tightness. But the point is, since he's talking about a very long exposure, then I want to say that especially with respect to asbestosis, you see, people who are having asbestosis, they may not develop symptoms at 20-25 years of age. They might develop symptoms maybe 20 or 25 years later. So my first thought process, because a very long history is given, I want to reiterate the fact. You see, textile worker, biocinosis, sugarcane dust, bagasosis, in all those conditions, there will always be symptoms whenever he will go to the factory. It's not that the symptoms will appear after 20-25 years. Every day goes to work, there will be symptoms present in a patient. So hypersensitivity pneumonitis topic, when you read in pathology or if you follow my discussion, you will notice me saying that a Monday chest tightness present in a textile worker, because you see Sunday is a holiday, no exposure, he was okay. When he went to the factory on Monday, symptoms were occurring. But here, because there was a lag period present, if a person is having exposure in asbestosis, symptoms develop pretty late. So the correct answer for this question will work out to be shipyard / whatever was available. And textile and cardboard I have ruled out anyway, and cardboard would be bagasosis, textile will be biocinosis, primarily because the symptoms tend to develop immediately. So I'm left between B versus C. And in silicosis anyway, with glass, I can say chances of development of tuberculosis will be high. So a lot of people were saying that actually there were multiple MCQs and all of them had answers of silicosis. I can say there were 3 MCQs on occupational lung disease. Out of 3, 2 had answer as silicosis, but 1 did not have answer as silicosis. In fact, this long history that is described is primarily to highlight this fact, and this is given in Robbins, the textbook of pathology, that in asbestosis the symptoms will develop many years later and may not be symptomatic immediately. The next question talks about snowstorm appearance. Snowstorm appearance is seen with miliary tuberculosis. We all know about it. But after it, whenever I have described snowstorm appearance, I've always talked about silicosis. Then they love to ask about pulmonary alveolar proteinosis, chickenpox pneumonia, I mean, forget about this exam. I can say every time you will go for a job, applying for a job anywhere as a medical officer in India, you will notice the consultant asking you regarding a snowstorm appearance, and at least these four differentials are something which you have to answer: miliary, TB, silicosis, PAP, hot favorite with examiners, and chickenpox pneumonia. And this time I think he made it easier. The answer would be A. So out of three questions, I think that the recall that I got, at least two of them should be answered as silicosis. The subsequent question said a young male is having no symptoms but auscultation reveals a wide fixed split second heart sound. Very classical, no. Fixed split second heart sound is always a feature of ASD, whereas when it comes to VSD, it will always be V for victory. VSD will be having a wide variable split second heart sound. When it comes to tetralogy of Fallot, the P2 component will not be heard. Why? Because pulmonic valve is hardly moving. There's a subpulmonic stenosis. So only A2 will be heard. P2 will not be heard. So we're going to call it a single S2. Bicuspid aortic valve, that's going to be responsible for valvular aortic stenosis. The auscultatory finding of aortic stenosis that has been described is narrow split second heart sound. In fact, I would like you to note down this information even right now, because lots of time we tend to forget the information related to heart sounds. But this, I would say, any of these can be asked in the subsequent years. And ASD anyway is a low pressure shunt, because the pressure difference between the left and the right atria is only 4 millimeters of mercury. So because it is a low pressure shunt, the symptoms may not be present or may present in extreme age group. Like, let me say if this patient, instead of being a male, was a female, and when this female became pregnant, that is when diagnosis of ASD is made. So lots of time ASD might have very minimal symptoms if it's a small ASD, and it may not be detected also. The answer to this question is A. Obviously, unless a person goes for an annual medical checkup and you as a physician are able to auscultate a wide fixed split second heart sound for these patients. All the remaining aspects which are present on this slide are questions of the future years and must be remembered, must be noted down. This question talked about history of abuse of painkillers. So you very well know abuse of painkillers can cause peptic ulcer disease. The patient had severe epigastric pain, and then an X-ray abdomen was given in an erect position where you can definitely see gas under the diaphragm. So considering all the information, the clinical diagnosis would be perforation peritonitis. That would be option number A. B and C can be ruled out because you will then be able to see dilated bowel loops. Whereas in this image, gas under diaphragm can be seen. You can differentiate between small and large bowel obstruction by checking out the size of the bowel loops. Small bowel obstruction will be having that classical stepladder pattern. The bowel loops would be central, and in large bowel obstruction, hostrations of the bowel can be seen and the bowel loops would be peripherally located. Stomach volvulus, again, the stomach would be folded on its own axis, though for stomach volvulus, I would say that it's a CT abdomen. That will be much more reliable. I don't think so that they will be giving you ever an X-ray, because even an expert may not be able to pick a stomach volvulus on an X-ray. You require a CT abdomen for that, because the stomach is folded on its own axis. But then perforation peritonitis is something that is always asked. So I would rate this as one of standard questions, which is bread and butter for you, in a sense that this keeps on help you to amplify your scores. The next question talks about a 60-year-old man who's presented with chronic cough, weight loss, and occasional episodes of hemoptysis. So when you read the history, you're thinking either it could be tuberculosis or it could be lung cancer. Now, mainly in tuberculosis, you will be having a history of massive hemoptysis. And more importantly, in tuberculosis, it is the upper lobe of the lung that is involved, where a cavity formation will be present. So when I spoke to my students, they said, sir, a couple of them said that in the upper lobe, we could pick up that golden S sign, which is telling you that there is a collapse of the upper lobe of the lung. Some people said, sir, this was not classically present, but what we could present was, I'm showing you two images, we could pick up was a hazy whiteness in one part of the lung, and this could be because there's a tumor which is growing in the bronchus and it will obstruct the bronchus. So air will not go in and there would be a collapse of the lung segment. So what I am saying is, because in tuberculosis, there would be massive hemoptysis, though tuberculosis can occur in all age groups, but considering that the age of the patient is 60, and there is occasional episodes of hemoptysis and there is evidence of collapse on a chest X-ray. So the first differential in this person would be kept as lung cancer. The answer to this question should be given as option number Bombay. I agree, in India tuberculosis is very common, so I would definitely be going in for a sputum CB NAT in this patient, because sometimes the diseases can coexist also. But considering the kind of a history given with the entire upper lobe showing a haziness, so that goes more in favor of a lung mass per se. As far as C is concerned, mesothelioma, it can be ruled out because mesothelioma will be having a pleural calcification. But if you look at the periphery of the lung, there is no evidence of any whiteness present. I mean, calcification will produce a white line. C says aspergillus, so aspergillosis causes central bronchiectasis. That will always be a CT given to you, with the bronchiectasis and dilated airways being present on the central part or on the medial parts of the lung. Aspergillus, especially ABP, allergic bronchopulmonary aspergilloma, is common in asthmatics. And considering the age group and the profile of the patient, unlikely to be an asthmatic patient, so I could rule out option number D as well. The subsequent question talked about a 40-year-old patient with dry cough. Then there was clubbing with late inspiratory crackles. That was very characteristic. I mean, the moment you read late inspiratory crackles, it is suggestive of pulmonary fibrosis in a patient. And to help you, they also gave the spirometry report. They interpreted it by themselves. I spoke to a lot of students. They said, sir, interpretation was already given, restrictive lung disease. The moment you read the word restrictive lung disease, option A and B are out, because chronic bronchitis and bronchiectasis are obstructive. That leaves you with two options, lung cancer versus pulmonary fibrosis. Whenever you are thinking about clubbing, yes, lung cancer can be a possibility, especially with cough and clubbing. Lung cancer can be a possibility, but because he has mentioned restrictive lung disease and especially this classical finding, basal late inspiratory crepitations, that's very classical for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, because of which the answer would be option number C. Lung cancer, points against lung cancer is the inspiratory crackles which are given and restrictive lung disease. I mean, as such, lung cancer does not produce any spirometric changes, no. Lung cancer will be a small mass somewhere in the lung. It can cause paraneoplastic manifestations, it can cause obstruction of the lung, it can cause maybe a segmental collapse. But to produce a florid reduction in FEV1 to the level of 60% and having a restrictive lung disease developing due to lung cancer would be a little far-fetched, I would say, as a theory or as a possibility. So pulmonary fibrosis should be given the first position in the differential diagnosis, and a CT chest of this person should subsequently be done. This was, I would say, a pediatrics anatomy medicine overlap. They showed a baby with anencephaly. And you very well know that for spina bifida, it's gonna be failure to closure of the posterior neuropore. But if a person is gonna be having inability, or I would say rather a total lack of closure of the anterior neuropore, anencephaly would be developing in the patient. The answer to this question would be option number alpha. Then there was a image like this post-mortem, where there was a black mass covering the heart of the patient, and surrounding this are the lungs. So the lungs are looking perfectly fine. I mean, I don't find any pathology in the lungs, but there's a black congealing mass which is covering the heart per se, and that's because this person had a cardiac tamponade. So even the surgeon would have talked about this, even the forensic chap would have talked about it. And other options, when I spoke to children, I mean, everybody said, sir, remaining options were related to lungs, and what we could pick up was mainly an aspect of the heart. The answer to this question is option number A. Then was regarding a newborn baby with tetralogy filed with thymus hypoplasia. The keyword is thymus hypoplasia, which tells you that this child would be having a decreased cell mediated immunity, and therefore the diagnosis of this case would be given as Dye-George syndrome. I mean, the remaining aspects do not fit the bill. In Down syndrome, we have a ASD. In Turner syndrome, we have a bicuspid aortic valve, or we can be having a coarctation of aorta. And Klinefelter, most of the time, they will ask you for the components of mental retardation and small testes and gynecomastia primarily. Then they asked about the X-ray findings of a patient of COVID-19. I've discussed that in COVID-19 video, very classical, very straightforward, also present on YouTube also. That would be ground glass opacities in the periphery. I mean, we always write as GGO. I can say like this, that prior to 2020, everybody used to talk about ground glass opacities with respect to interstitial lung disease. But now whenever you read about peripheral ground glass opacities in the lower lobes, that's going to be suggestive of COVID-19 pneumonia in a person. The subsequent question talked about a 70-year-old man with low backache. Every time you read about a geriatric age patient with low backache, either it could be cancer of the prostate, or it could be multiple myeloma, On workup, he's having anemia with elevated serum creatinine. So he is trying to tell you about features of CRAB. You very well know on CRAB, C would be hypercalcemia, renal failures, that's elevated serum creatinine, anemia is present. So out of CRAB, at least two features are present. I have told you that even if any one of these are present, we would call it a myeloma defining event per se. And then on the X-ray skull of this patient, you can notice that this is a raindrop configuration of lytic lesions present in the skull of the patient. So this would anyway help you in coming to the diagnosis of this patient as A. With histiocytosis, he will mainly give you a description of a child, and on the X-ray skull of the patient, the lesions that will be present will not be these raindrop configuration, but the lesions will be looking like the map of a country. So every time you read about a child with lytic lesions on the skull and geographical skull, and they will not be round, well-defined punched out lesions, but with very ill-defined margins like it is in a map. When it comes to parathyroid adenoma, the history does not support it. Parathyroid adenoma will be then having, parathyroid adenoma can be having a pepper pot skull. That's okay, because PTH is more, lytic lesions can be present. But in parathyroid adenoma, creatinine will not be elevated. Parathyroid adenoma will not be having anemia, and there is no description of low backache, and parathyroid adenoma can occur in young age also. So considering the age group of the patient along with features of CRAB also given in the question, the answer is well justified. Paget's disease again occurs in old age, but the classical feature of Paget's disease would be ivory skull. The skull will appear more white than normal. I mean, extensively white. I mean, Paget's disease is characterized by imbalance between the osteoblast and the osteoclast, and what happens is that the osteoblastic activity will predominate, so the skull will look extremely white. So you always read ivory skull, ivory vertebra for Paget's disease, and that is how I'm ruling it out, because here I'm not seeing any exaggerated whiteness in the skull. What I'm seeing here is very classical lytic lesions. So I think this was really a spot diagnosis. I mean, not the kind of a question that requires a detailed discussion. The subsequent question said patient had a gastrectomy done. So whenever you have gastrectomy, intrinsic factor deficiency will occur, B12 deficiency can occur. And while you're evaluating this patient for cataract surgery, you also found that he's having anemia, understandable, with the following finding. If I just zoom into the image, you can notice that there is atrophy of all the papillae of the tongue, circumvallate, filiform papillae. I mean, no papillae can be visualized. So I'm going to use the word beefy tongue in this case. And even if you're not able to pick up the beefy tongue, it really does not matter. With gastrectomy and anemia, the diagnosis of this patient would be given as pernicious anemia, that is vitamin B12 deficiency, which makes A as an answer. Then there was a question in which you could see the fusion of the two fingers of the foot in this patient. That would be a diagnosis of syndactyly. Phocomelia, you very well know, you are going to read it with thalidomide. And in patients of phocomelia, the head is going to be perfectly normal, the trunk is going to be normal, but the bones of the arms are literally going to be absent, the bones of the legs are going to be absent. So you can see literally the feet are attached to the torso and the hands are attached to the torso. So head and trunk are okay, but you know, the humerus and the radius are not developed. Then in the lower limbs are also not developed. So phocomelia can easily be ruled out. Klippel-Feil syndrome, where you have a very classical, the person would be having this classical appearance of the neck. So you have a low posterior hairline, you have a short neck, there's limitation of the neck motion per se. So this is itself a image based question for the future years. And Madelung syndrome is again a MCQ. This is characterized by, this is very common in gymnasts. And Madelung syndrome is characterized by problems with the growth of the distal end of the radius. I mean, that's the statement you need to remember, that there is a partial deficiency. I would just like to say that in gymnasts, due to continuous pressure on the distal end of the radius, there is a defective development of the distal end of the radius primarily. That's called as Madelung deformity. Answer to this question is alpha, and option number B, C, D can be questions of the future years. The next question talks about a child who's having pyoderma and pustules on the leg, and after 3 weeks he's having cola colored urine. Or repeat from previous years. You see this person was having infection with group A beta hemolytic streptococcus, and subsequent to this there was formation of immune complexes, so type 3 hypersensitivity reaction, and these immune complexes caused a starry sky kidney. I think a very standard presentation. First you are having skin infection, and after a couple of weeks there is going to be a development of hematuria with hypertension. The hypertension of these patients can be so severe that they can be encephalopathy or they can even be a left ventricular failure. All of this points towards diagnosis as post streptococcal glomerulonephritis. I mean, every time you get a question on cola colored urine and there is a preceding sore throat or skin infection, any of the two can be present. Traditionally in previous years he has been asking about sore throat and then after a few weeks cola colored urine for PSG, and this time he just changed the history a bit. Instead of talking about a sore throat, he spoke regarding skin infection in a person. B is minimal chain disease. It anyway causes nephrotic syndrome. Immunoglobulin A nephropathy will not be having any history with respect to pyoderma. In IgA nephropathy, there will always be a respiratory tract infection, URTI, and after 48 hours of this URTI, there is gonna be a hematuria. So this can be a question in the future years, like since he has already asked you PSGN, he can describe an adult. He had a sore throat and after 48 hours there is a hematuria. That would be immunoglobulin A nephropathy, that is Burgess disease. And focal segmental glomerulosclerosis is again nephrotic syndrome. So I can anyway rule out option number B and D, because nephrotic syndrome, he will describe foamy urine, he will describe hypoalbuminemia, he will describe edema, puffy eyes. So the history will be very, very classical, but I have just tried to invest some time into discussing the remaining options also for this particular question. And yes, Burgess disease description that I given in option number C should also be remembered. The subsequent question talks about a 50-year-old man. He had a road traffic accident. He's having a cerebral edema. So every time you are having a cytotoxic cerebral edema, though I did ask my students, was it written presence of vasogenic cerebral edema? Because for vasogenic cerebral edema we give steroids. No, vasogenic cerebral edema is seen with neurocystic sarcosis and brain tumor. So everybody said no sir, there was no scenario of any brain tumor. It was simply that the guy had an accident and after that there is a cerebral edema. So this is cytotoxic cerebral edema basically, and for this we will give mannitol. But suppose in the future years in the exam they change the question and they make it vasogenic cerebral edema, the answer would be steroids. The next question talked about a patient of COPD who is on salmeterol, and that means LABA, and is still having breathlessness. So I need to add an additional drug for the management of these patients. In all patients of COPD, after LABA, the next drug that we add is a long-acting antimuscarinic agent. That's gonna be tiotropium for management of these patients. And even if this is not causing an improvement, then we are gonna be adding inhaled corticosteroids for these patients. So option A I'm ruling out because we don't use systemic steroids because of the side effect profile. We rather use inhaled corticosteroids. Roflumilast is a new drug. It can be used, but then majorly for patients of COPD, we want to neutralize the bronchospasm by using an anticholinergic drug. That could be tiotropium because it's relatively longer acting, and nebulized salbutamol also looks like a good option, but this is a rescue therapy. Like if the question was saying that he's having breathlessness right now and in emergency, what will you do? So yeah, I can give nebulized salbutamol to the patient, but I cannot give nebulized salbutamol for a long duration, because you very well know that if you give salbutamol continuously for 5 to 7 days, then there is development of tolerance. That tolerance is called as tachyphylaxis because of the side effect that comes up. Tachyphylaxis basically means that there is tolerance. So we should not be using salbutamol on a regular basis, but salbutamol should be used mainly on emergency basis as a rescue therapy only. Here for long-term management, it is tiotropium. If not available, then ipratropium will be used for this case. The answer to this question would be option number C. This question talks about a baby who turns blue at birth, that is resolving on crying. Now the point is that babies are obligatory nose breathers. If a baby is born with choanal atresia, he is not gonna be able to breathe from his nose. So this baby, if is feeling uncomfortable, so what will he do? He will cry, and when he will cry, air will go inside and therefore the cyanosis part will reduce. So the clinical diagnosis of this patient, there was no image given in this question, that I've just added just to explain the topic to you. I mean, every time you read a question that the baby is having cyanosis, that is worsening on crying. Worsening on crying, it is diaphragmatic hernia. And whenever it is improvement on crying, it is choanal atresia. For this baby, what you can do is that the nipple that is available, no, like you put a nipple over a bottle and you feed a baby. So you can just cut the distal end of the nipple, put it in the mouth of the child so that the baby will keep on sucking on the nipple and at least some air will keep on going inside. So the correct answer for this would be to secure a oropharyngeal airway for these patients. We technically call it the McGovern principle. So you will definitely see the ENT chap discussing about it. But from my perspective, I want you to to remember that every time a question begins by describing central cyanosis in a baby, there can be two situations. One is that the child's central cyanosis is improving with crying. Second possibility is the central cyanosis of the baby is worsening with crying. If he says the word central cyanosis is improving with crying, that is what we are talking about, choanal atresia. McGovern principle is to be used, a wide bore nipple is to be used. But if it is going to be a congenital diaphragmatic hernia and he says what is the first step, your answer will be nasogastric tube. I repeat once again. In choanal atresia, we have to use a nipple, put it in the mouth of the child. The baby will keep on sucking on the nipple, so air will keep on going inside. McGovern principle, wide bore nipple is the answer. Whereas if it's gonna be congenital diaphragmatic hernia, the stomach is in the chest. The stomach will distend when the baby will cry, and it will put pressure on the ipsilateral lung as well as on the contralateral lung because the stomach is distended. You need to decompress the stomach, and for that you will have to put in a nasogastric tube. So both these questions have been asked. I mean, first line management for cyanosis in diaphragmatic hernia, first line management for cyanosis developing in choanal atresia, which I've handled here. Coming to the next question, he talked about breastfeeding. You see, breastfeeding is absolutely contraindicated in an inborn error of metabolism, that is galactosemia. In fact, in galactosemia, you cannot even give formula feed to the baby, no, because formula feed is made from cow milk. So I usually in my discussion say like this, that you cannot give breast milk, you cannot give cow's milk, animal milk, or whatever milk, right? I mean, it could be elephant milk, it could be whale milk, whatever, but no milk, animal source milk cannot be given to these children. It is only soya milk or vegetable milk that can be given to these children only. So galactosemia is an absolute contraindication. It's an inborn error of metabolism, and if you continue giving any feed to this child where galactose is component, because galactose is a component of animal milk all the time, so it will contribute to cataract, it will contribute to failure to thrive, recurrent vomitings in this child. For maternal cytomegalovirus, we can give breastfeed. Similarly with hepatitis C, no issue, especially in India. And in D, it was written herpes infection without nipple involvement. So, okay, we can breastfeed. And somebody said, sir, maybe breast abscess was also given. So my point is, in breast abscess, if it is on one side, the mother can feed from the contralateral side. Obviously, whichever side breast abscess is present, you can't breastfeed, but the contralateral side can definitely be utilized. The subsequent question talked about a patient with myeloma defining events. That's going to be a feature of multiple myeloma. I mean, CRAB, any one of these, hypercalcemia, renal failure, that is elevated serum creatinine, anemia, and bonylytic lesions. He says, what is the next test for diagnosis? A lot of guys answered here casually as PET CT scan. You see, if I said, what is the imaging modality for multiple myeloma? It is PET CT, because I want to pick up the lytic lesions everywhere in the body. It could be in the ribs, clavicle, vertebra, pelvis, skull. I can do a PET CT. But the question is asking for diagnosis. For diagnosis of multiple myeloma, the test you will do will be a serum electrophoresis. In fact, for multiple myeloma, this is what I have described. First of all, you need to describe that this person is having on bone marrow plasma cells more than 10%. This would be a finding with respect to a bone marrow examination. Then the subsequent finding should be a serum or a urinary protein electrophoresis, and this should be revealing evidence of M spike, and any one of these can be present. CRAB, any one of these would mean, all of these are referred as myeloma like events. So the point is, you need all three of these for diagnosis of multiple myeloma. This is a triad actually for diagnosis of multiple myeloma, out of which question wise, point number 1 is the investigation of choice, and point number 2 is the screening test. And if all three are satisfied, then you say, okay, this is multiple myeloma. That means answer to this question would be option number C. The question said a platoon of soldiers is on a march for 40 kilometers at 40 degrees Celsius. So let me say deep in the jungles of Chhattisgarh, this is a elite unit of commandos of CRPF, and they are on a move. And you are the medical officer or the medical, the medical unit attached to this platoon. So 10 soldiers have been brought with heat exhaustion, because anyway he was mentioning very high temperature, and somebody is doing physical exercise, the person is bound to fall sick. So the soldiers were brought dehydrated, disoriented, and with sweating. So the clinical findings in this patient are pointing towards heat exhaustion primarily. And if it is not treated, then there's a possibility that some of these soldiers have already gone into development of heat stroke. Why I'm saying heat stroke per se is because even CNS manifestations were given in the form of the soldiers being disoriented and not being able to recognize the company commander or not being able to tell their own name. In these circumstances, I need to lower the body temperature of these patients. Option A said wash and immerse limbs with cold water. My point is, if you are gonna be putting the limbs of this person in cold water, then cold water will cause vasoconstriction, and vasoconstriction will cause heat retention in the body. You should never use chilled water, at least ice cold water should never be used, because if you will cause vasoconstriction, heat retention will worsen the patient. That means option number A and B are out. Injection prochlorperazine. Prochlorperazine is the salt in Avil injection. Lots of time these patients might develop chills, especially when you will lower their body temperature. That's when chills can develop. For that you can use prochlorperazine, but the primary treatment for this soldier would be that you will cover their body with a wet sheet. You can use I can say you can use tap water and then you can switch on the fan. So what I want in these patients is evaporation. I want evaporative losses to occur from the body of the soldier. That's the best way to get rid of the extra heat. Otherwise, these patients can develop even a full-blown stroke as well. The answer to this question is option number delta. In the previous years, they have asked about frostbite. So environmental medicine slash, I would say, some aspects which frostbite is taught in surgery also, because so what I want to say is environmental aspects, frostbite and heat exhaustion, heat stroke is also to be remembered. And the topic of heat stroke was even asked in the NEET exam. So anyway, because the questions of NEET and FMG, I would say they keep on shuffling them. So there's a possibility that the questions can be, the NEET PG exam questions are asked in FMG, and FMG questions can be asked in NEET exam also. So it's always a good idea to listen to the NEET PG discussion as well, where again heat stroke aspect I've mentioned. And the older thought process was, and this is one of the primary reasons that I've written both the terms here. The earlier thought process was that when the sweating will stop, that is when heat stroke will develop in a patient, but that is not the case. Sweating stops very late. So I'm not gonna wait for the sweating to stop to say that okay, heat stroke has occurred. If any person on heat exposure subsequently is having a disorientation or CNS issues, heat stroke should definitely be considered as the first differential diagnosis. And the answer to this question is option number D, which will ensure evaporative losses of water from the body. The next question talks about a 62-year-old patient who is ill for 8 months, a relatively long history though. On examination, sternal tenderness and hepatosplenomegaly is present. Both of these present findings go towards favor of diagnosis of leukemia. Though the history is relatively long, that's okay. But the point is sternal tenderness, hepatosplenomegaly favor development of leukemia of the acute variety. Anyway, we don't base our diagnosis on only duration of symptoms, because person can be feeling unwell. That can be subjective finding. CBC is showing a hemoglobin of 6.7. So hemoglobin is less. TLC is 2500. Why TLC can be less in leukemia is because if there is a maturational arrest, there can be development of what is called as aleukemic leukemia. That is, the cancer is limited only to the bone marrow and it has not spilled over into the peripheral circulation. So if there's a maturational arrest, the TLC or the total leukophocyte count of the patient can reduce also. The platelet count of the patient was 1,90,000. That is normal in this case. And the bone marrow examination shows a myeloid to erythroid ratio of approximately 4:1. So because of the myeloid ratio being exaggerated, normal myeloid to erythroid ratio is 2:3:1. Here the ratio is about 4:1. I am thinking in possibility of acute leukemia. A lot of people said, sir, it is 8 months, so why it is not chronic leukemia? Then in chronic myeloid leukemia, point number 1 is that CML usually has a TLC which is increased to, I would say, normal, and platelet count is increased in CML. And also in chronic myeloid leukemia, you always will be having splenomegaly. You don't have sternal tenderness. Majority of cases of chronic myeloid leukemia, you will read massive splenomegaly and you will not read about sternal tenderness. So I'm ruling out option number A in this case, primarily because of two reasons. Clinically, we don't have sternal tenderness, we have massive splenomegaly there. and on bone marrow examination in the patient, it should reveal evidence of shift to left, which was one of the questions that has been discussed previously. So I'm not gonna say that this is chronic myeloid leukemia. I heard a couple of people saying PNH also, but then PNH should be having evidence of change in the color of urine, no? I mean, in PNH, there has to be hemoglobinuria. There was no mention in the history with respect to dark color urine of an individual for this particular question. So if there's no change in the color of urine, and moreover in PNH, you should also be having findings like neutrophil alkaline phosphatase score being given to be lesser, recurrent infections developing in a patient, and PNH has Budd-Chiari syndrome. So there would be a hepatic vein thrombosis. So unless and until you read about hepatic vein thrombosis, you read about NAP score being lesser, CD55, CD59 information, PNH is a very unlikely answer. If you look at D, aplastic anemia, couple of guys casually, because they found hemoglobin was less, TLC was less, they assumed it is pancytopenia. But then in aplastic anemia, yes, you get pancytopenia, but there is no hepatosplenomegaly. I repeat my statement, there is no organomegaly in aplastic anemia. You don't have sternal tenderness, you don't have hepatosplenomegaly in aplastic anemia, which is why I'm ruling it out. The correct answer for this question would be acute leukemia. Some people said acute myeloid was not given, so the answer would be given as acute leukemia. So I agree to the fact that acute leukemia will have a fast onset, but then, you know, history is something which a patient is projecting before you. Oh, doctor, I've been unwell, I feel tired all the time. So there is a possibility that this could have been maybe even instead of 8 months, he could have written 10 months also. What I have to look at here is mainly the examination findings, because that is what will be accurate, because you are checking it. You see, you are not relying on the patient's words. You are relying on what you have seen, and the blood counts of the patient and the bone marrow picture of the patient all fits towards diagnosis of acute leukemia. And yes, you can have acute leukemia in old people also. No? Acute myeloid leukemia occurs in old age. Now coming to this slide, this question was not asked in the exam. I have deliberately just created this question to tell you how PNH will present. Paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria is a condition where you definitely read about a high color urine or a black color urine of a person, but over and above this, in this condition, platelets are defective. What I mean by defective platelets is not that the number of platelets is more. Platelet count is normal, but they tend to actually exhibit an increased amount of platelet aggregation even without a stimulus. You see, in you and me, injury will occur, then platelets will aggregate. Here, without even any stimulus of injury, there is a platelet aggregation which causes hepatic vein thrombosis. There's a splenic vein thrombosis. So with this background information, I have a patient who's having tummy pain and dark colored urine. So issues of urine are given, and on examination, there's a hepatosplenomegaly. The workup shows anemia, neutropenia, and normal platelets. Now I want to tell you that in this condition, the RBCs counts can definitely be lesser, in a sense that there is a hemolysis. You see, CD55 is present on RBC. In this condition, CD55 is missing. So there is a complement mediated hemolysis. The reason for anemia in PNH is complement mediated intravascular hemolysis. Then we also have defective neutrophils in these patients. The NAP score is lesser, as a result of which the chances of infection will increase. The platelet count is normal, but the platelets are defective in a sense that platelet aggregation can occur in these patients even without any stimulus, and that can explain hepatic and splenic vein thrombosis. So unless and until he does not give you a description of Budd-Chiari, unless and until he does not describe hepatic or splenic vein thrombosis, we cannot comment on the diagnosis of PNH in any question. There are 3 cell lines which are affected. Obviously, RBCs are involved. They are getting destroyed. Why? Because of CD59 being absent. And why is the platelet exhibiting a auto aggregation? Platelets are kept under check. In you and me, platelets don't undergo aggregation without any trauma. No, that's because CD59 keeps them under check. If CD59 is missing, platelets go into auto aggregation mode. So this disease, I will say, is more a disease with respect to problem of the quality as compared to quantity. You see, normally in leukemia we read about quantity, but here the problem is mainly with respect to the quality, that CD59 is missing, so the platelets go into auto aggregation mode, and therefore Budd-Chiari syndrome can occur in a patient. This is a separate slide that I've highlighted. Even removed the standard color on the slide just to highlight that this particular question was not asked in the exam, guys. I've just created it to highlight how PNH can be given to you. The next image that was given was a physiology based one, where what you can notice is that on one side there is gonna be loss of proprioception. Now there was no mention per se that which sensation is lost, but I'm still saying on one side there is a loss of proprioception, and on the opposite side you are noticing one level lower. I'll just zoom it in for your convenience. On the other side there was one level lower contralateral loss of pain and temperature. So if you have read about Brown-Séquard syndrome, that is hemisection of the spinal cord in physiology, you will notice that the contralateral pain or temperature will not be at the same level. It is one level lower. That's because of the physiological and the anatomical way the lateral spinothalamic tract is traveling in the body. The answer to this question will be option number C. GBS is Guillain-Barré syndrome. There will be no level present. I mean, GBS I'm ruling out because there is no motor level or sensory level. It just presents as flaccid paraplegia. Then it becomes a flaccid quadriplegia. Then there can be neck muscle paralysis, facial muscle paralysis in a person. So it's a ascending paralysis and does not have a level as described here. Wallenberg syndrome is related to posterior inferior cerebellar artery, where face of the patient gets involved. So this could be a potential question in the forthcoming years, though it is well covered in the topic of stroke. On one side of the face, all sensations will be lost. On the face, it's hot, cold, pain, temperature, everything lost. But on the body, on the opposite side, only two sensations, pain and temperature, would be lost. So the shading will be, or the section will be like on one side of the face and opposite side of the body for Wallenberg syndrome that I have highlighted before you. Then is Millard-Gubler syndrome. Here we have 6th and 7th cranial nerve palsy. Whereas in this image that is given to you, I mean, we are not talking about any cranial nerves, but a section of the spinal cord that is called as Brown-Séquard syndrome. And how did I pick up what this side is proprioception is because the levels were given to be unequal. If you read the data, you will notice on the same side dorsal column is cut and lateral spinothalamic is coming from the opposite side. So it will be one level lower that the pain and temperature sensation would be affected. Dorsal column on one side, lateral spinothalamic crossover from the opposite side is involved in Brown-Séquard. This question that I'm showing you right now is based on the COVID-19 epidemic. I mean, we would have all seen rhinocerebral mucormycosis developing in our patients who were having diabetes. People who are having diabetes are anyway having less immunity, and with ketoacidosis there is anyway stress on the body, so we tend to give steroids also in COVID-19. So combination of diabetes plus acidosis plus steroids, are repeating, in combination of diabetes plus acidosis plus the component of steroids being given, all contribute to the growth of mucorales, and that contributes to rhinocerebral mucormycosis. This question said unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia with remaining enzymes being normal. SGOT is normal, SGPT is normal, SAP is normal. So let's work out the options. Carcinoma head of pancreas will cause obstructive jaundice. Obstructive jaundice will always contribute to development of increase in the value of conjugated bilirubin as well as serum alkaline phosphatase, whereas in this question the remaining enzymes were given to be normal. Viral hepatitis will always be having SGPT and SGOT elevation. So I can rule out two options right away in this question. I'm left with chronic pancreatitis. I mean, pancreatitis will usually not cause jaundice. Pancreatitis will cause epigastric pain in alcoholic. So the answer to this question would be option number alpha, Gilbert syndrome, which is characterized by defect in UDP glucuronide transferase. So the conjugation capability is hampered, and if the conjugation is hampered, that is why unconjugated bilirubin values will be increased in these patients. That's why the answer to this question is option number A. The next question talked about a child who is anemic with an MCV of less than 70. So that would be microcytic anemia. And in this kid, subsequently we gave blood transfusions, but hemoglobin is not rising. So the clinical diagnosis of this child where blood transfusions are not causing a rise of hemoglobin is thalassemia. Age of the child was not given, but I'm assuming either it will be thalassemia intermedia or it will be thalassemia major, because that is where blood transfusions are given. We don't give blood transfusions for thalassemia minor per se. So either it is major or intermediate based on age group, which I could not get. But yeah, if you can comment and let me know in my email at marvamedicine@gmail.com in case you attempted this question. And considering the aspect of thalassemia, we will have to go in for a hemoglobin electrophoresis for these patients. Osmotic fragility is not very specific and requires, I would say, it can have a bias also. You see, between A and B, why I'm selecting A is because A has mathematical values, it's standardized test. So I can quantify, no, if a particular type of hemoglobin is more in the body, like if I do hemoglobin electrophoresis in this child, fetal hemoglobin will be increased, hemoglobin A will be less, hemoglobin A2 values will also be increased to more than 3%. So I mean, this is the report which is given mathematical values, so I can interpret better, but osmotic fragility is dependent on the interpretation of a lab technician. I cannot rely on a lab technician to tell me, okay, osmotic fragility is more or lesser, or even on a pathologist. I mean, if he is tired, if he is not experienced, he can definitely be responsible for you giving a wrong diagnosis for your patient. So it's always good to rely on technology, which is why I've selected A. Serum iron anyway is ruled out because if this particular person was having iron deficiency anemia, if you give blood transfusion, hemoglobin would have risen anyway. One close option was direct Coombs test. Now, if it was, let me say, MCV of I would say more than 70, something in the range of 80, 90 or 100 also, I could have thought in terms of autoimmune hemolytic anemia, but considering microcytic anemia, no, the mnemonic for microcytic anemia was SITA, that is sideroblastic iron deficiency, thalassemia and anemia of chronic disease. So I have to think in those lines only, that this could be possibility of thalassemia in the patient. The question said a patient has undergone a hip replacement after fracture neck of femur, and after 5 days he is presented with breathlessness. The diagnosis of this patient was wrongly answered by a lot of people as fat embolism. You see, for fat embolism, you not only need to have presentation with respect to lungs and breathlessness, but over and above this, GERD criteria have to be satisfied. So CNS malfunction should be present. Then we should also be having presence of petechiae, and even hematological aspects like development of anemia should be documented in the question, or fat globules in the urine should be documented. So none of that information was given. In fact, I've highlighted in my discussions that pulmonary thromboembolism is a great masquerader. Like if somebody has undergone a hip replacement, after hip replacement, this person will not be allowed to walk. So there can be immobilization which can contribute to stasis of blood in the calf veins. And that stasis of blood in the calf veins can then contribute to development of sudden onset dyspnea. And usually this will occur after 2 to 3 days of surgery. So the answer to this question should be given as diagnosis as venous thromboembolism. That would be pulmonary embolism basically. Air embolism is what is seen with respect to trauma to the internal jugular vein. Like somebody went to a ATM, when he came out of the cash, there was a robber outside and he slashed the jugular vein of the patient with a knife. Then cutting of the jugular vein will cause the blood to be sucked towards the heart and will cause air embolism. Systemic embolism means patient is having patent fossa ovalis. Let me just explain systemic embolism to you. Suppose somebody is having deep vein thrombosis. In deep vein thrombosis, the clots will go from the soleal veins to the right side of the heart. This person is having a patent fossa ovalis. So from the right atria, the clots will go to left atria. From left atria to the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle it will go into systemic circulation to the brain. So the problem is deep vein thrombosis traditionally involves the right side of the heart, but with the patent fossa ovalis, the clots can go to the left side of the heart and then can go to the brain also. So definitely option number C cannot be present, because then patent fossa ovalis requires a documentation with the echocardiography. Here this person is not presenting with stroke. He did not present with stroke, no. The person is having, after hip replacement, a standard presentation of, first he would have developed deep vein thrombosis, the clots in the soleal veins broke off from here, went into the RA, RV, pulmonary artery, and are blocking the pulmonary artery, contributing to development of pulmonary thromboembolism. So the answer to this question is option number A, and was wrongly answered on social media as by various people as fat embolism. And then there was another question on pulmonary embolism where he asked for the investigational choice. That would be a CT angiography, a CTPA. I mean, in the image you will notice this is pulmonary artery, this is the branches, and there's a big thrombus that would be occluding bang in the middle of the artery. I mean, you would be able to identify this. Most of the time posteriorly will be the vertebra that would be given, and there's a contrast in the pulmonary artery that can be identified, and along this on the two sides would be lungs present. So most of the time CTPA is a very easy way to identify this and has been highlighted in the main lecture of pulmonary embolism as well. The subsequent question said a patient of mitral valve disease was started on warfarin, because anybody who's having mitral valve disease, there is a high possibility that there will be dilatation of the left atria. You see, mitral valve is obstructed, so left atria will be dilated. That will trigger atrial fibrillation, and atrial fibrillation can then contribute to clots, and these clots can go into the systemic circulation. So the question said you have to start warfarin in this patient anyway, but then this warfarin which is started will achieve a target INR of what particular value. The point is INR is alternate term for prothrombin time. Prothrombin time normal is 11 to 16 seconds. What he's asking you is by how much you can increase of normal, then you can increase to up to 2 to 3 times of normal. The objective here is that I do not want the clots to be formed and then go into the brain and cause development of stroke. In all patients of mitral valve disease, if there is documentation of an enlarged left atria, it means the clots will begin to form. I'm not going to wait for the clots to form and this guy will wake up with the aphasia or will develop with facial asymmetry or will wake up with the arm weakness or will develop weakness of half side of the body. I mean, what we would like to do for these cases would be prevent the development of embolic stroke by ensuring a target INR of 2 to 3 times of normal. That is a PT of round about 45 seconds, right? I mean, if I take 15 seconds for calculation purposes, 15 into 2 would be 30, 15 into 3 would be 45. So if it is between this range, not a problem. But suppose it becomes 20 times of normal, that's a problem, no? Because then brain hemorrhage will occur. So obviously you need to control the dosage here. And as I've shown you a reference here also, that because of the risk of atrial fibrillation, the INR of these patients should be kept anything between range of 2 to 3 of the normal value. I mean, if you increase beyond that, then the problems that will develop in this person would be, I would say, a non-rheumatic atrial fibrillation is one of the leading causes of development of embolic stroke. So these are the aspects, guys, that I would like to discuss here, though I've discussed some MCQs which might have been covered with the other subjects as well, but I've tried to keep my discussion and horizon as vast as possible so that you can have a broader overview and are able to solve the questions. I mean, the moment you read the question, your brain has to click. Okay, what is the first line saying? What is the second line saying? Joining the dots like a detective and then coming to a clinical diagnosis is what you do, and you are doing a great job. I mean, listening to me, if you have listened to me so long here, I'm very sure that all of you would come out with flying colors. So keep the pressure on, keep hammering, and you'll do great.